Hello, welcome to this conversation facilitated by the Susanna Wesley Foundation. At the Foundation, we are a community of scholars and practitioners who promote dialogue, support research and create resources in order to equip churches and those who work in them, and to facilitate the building of flourishing community through transformative change. You can find us at our website, susannawesleyfoundation.org. We hope you enjoy this conversation.
Welcome to this conversation with Lucy Zwolinska and Justin Thacker, and we're going to be talking about poverty issues, tax justice, economic justice in general. So I'm going to begin by asking them to introduce themselves. So Justin, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Hi, thanks, Emma, and thanks for inviting me onto this podcast. It's a real privilege to be able to be part of this conversation. So my name is Justin Thacker. I'm currently the Director of Church Action for Tax Justice, which is a campaigning organisation which is part of the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility. That's a bit of a mouthful. But anyway, we try and hold corporations to account, specifically on this issue of tax justice. My background is as a theologian, so I mention that just in case that comes up at some point during the conversation we're about to have.
Thank you. And you wrote the book, Global Poverty, a Theological Guide. So I'll just throw that in as well as important.
That was a fun thing to write. A lot of it came out of kind of even before becoming a theologian. I did some work in East Africa, and a lot of my thinking around the global poverty book came out of my experiences there. So, yeah.
Great. Thanks. And Lucy.
Hi. Yeah, it's so good to be here today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. My name's Lucy. I'm currently working in my hometown of Gateshead. I'm a lay worker with one of the Methodist circuits there and have what I think is a very cool job. I really enjoy it. And I think in some ways it's quite unusual. And in other ways, I'm helping the circuit to do things that Methodist circuits around the connection are already doing. So I'm a community development worker. So I spend times with the communities in which our churches are or in which there are expressions of church, and spend time with communities, seeing what's going on, where God's at work, and hoping that we can do a bit of joining in. And I'm also involved with something called Gateshead Poverty Truth Commission, which is possibly the most exciting thing I've ever been involved with. And it is a long and slow and careful process by which we're working to bring together people who know what it is to live in poverty in Gateshead, with people who hold power in Gateshead, with civic and business and cultural leaders, to develop relationships and to think about what really positive systems change would look like. And although we don't talk about God in that space, that is also part of my work with the Methodist Church. And I think it's good news just that the Methodist Church knows that there's importance there and that God's at work wherever we're talking about hopeful solutions to poverty. So that's me.
That's brilliant. Thanks. I'll come back to you, Lucy. What do you love about it? I mean, you're clearly quite passionate about what you're doing.
I do really like it. I mean, one of my primary drivers for applying for this job, I remember, was that I just really like spending time with people. And 2020 has been a bit of a bummer for us all, to put it lightly and flippantly. I shouldn't do that. But it's meant that I haven't been able to spend as much time in communities as I would have liked. Because what I really, really enjoy is just getting to know people and building relationships with people who actually in my normal life I might not rub shoulders with at all, and have had the absolute privilege of getting to know really, really well. And actually last Monday, for the first time since before the pandemic started, we reopened a food market in one of the communities we work in. And it's a great morning. Lots of people come in and pick up food, and it's pay as you feel. It's part of the Fair Share network. And I was so excited. I got there 15 minutes early and said, "Oh, please let me stand with the vegetables and help people select their veg." I was like jumping on people to have conversations because I was seeing people in real life for the first time in 6, 7, 8 months. And that really reminded me about the stuff that I love most about this work.
Yeah, it must be very hard for you now not to be able to do the very thing that's at the heart of what you do.
Yeah, if communities are about relationships, it's really shown how important just like sharing food and a cup of tea and being able to share space together is. And lots of the communities that I work in are victim to the digital divide. So we haven't been able to Zoom. And there have actually been lots of organisations that have been trying to get people in, like digitally isolated communities online in this time. But then I ask, digital for what? Because some of these folk haven't had families that have been online, and actually they might not have had enough money to put on their fuel and electricity. And I think, if we look at thinking about like Maslow's hierarchy of need, are we just parachuting in things that we think are part of a fulfilling life and not starting with some of the real basics? So yeah, that's stuff that I had not thought about before this pandemic and this lockdown, but it's been a real pressure point for some communities, I think.
And what about, Justin, with your job, what is it that you engage with the most? And have you seen any changes in this pandemic time?
Well, lots of changes personally, as kind of Lucy has said, and not being able to access people, but I think also probably not being able to exert influence in the same way. So Church Action for Tax Justice, we campaign at a structural level, and part of what we do is around lobbying politicians and parliamentarians and so on. And that's difficult enough at the best of times, when you're able to do it face to face, but when you're trying to engage remotely, it just makes it a whole lot harder. And so you can still write letters and you can send emails and so on, but that loss of face-to-face communication just sometimes hinders you from delivering a message perhaps quite as powerfully or effectively as you might do. And I, like both of you, also normally spend quite a bit of time talking to church groups and so on. And again, not being able to do that, there's something about being able to communicate in that direct way, and through it you communicate, I guess, your passion for an issue, your passion for a subject, and that just doesn't come across however good you are on Zoom, or however well you've written an article and so on. So I think what I'm trying to say is, I think over lockdown there has been perhaps a loss of influence, which has been a real shame, but there's still, the work carries on. And for us it is about trying to tackle poverty and inequality. And our particular part of that piece of the picture is tackling poverty and inequality through campaigning for tax justice.
Yeah. When I read some of your things and watched a little introductory video to the place that you work for, Lucy, which is really nicely done. When I investigated your work, I was looking for things that, connected your work together. They're distinct, but there's obviously overlap. And I think one of the words I wrote down was power, which you both mention, and you're sort of mediators in a sense, facilitators of connecting people with power and how they can use it. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that, because I think that's an area of overlap. Whoever would like to answer first.
I spend a lot of time thinking about power on a really personal level as well as a structural level. So I think that we see imbalances of power at every level in society. And thinking about your work, Justin, globally, and when power becomes policy, whether that be like economic policy or social welfare policy, then we see that those who lack power feel that in a really practical sense. So in some of the communities I work in, that means a lack of power because it's a lack of money, but it's also a lack of voice, of being listened to, a lack of opportunity. Yeah, and so that is so real. And I think when we talk about having to change systems and policies, some of that is about redistributing power in really practical ways. But I also think a lot about my own power and my own privilege as a middle-class white woman going into communities. And the challenge for me is always to not make it about me and not come in with my own agenda and use that power to find people who will fit it, and to use that influence over people. And so I think the challenge for individuals and communities is to steer away from thinking of ourselves as Jesus figures who say, do you know what, we have God on our side and we know what is right, and so we're going to speak for and to people who lack power, whether that be poorer communities or the global south, thinking about all our bits of work. I read a really interesting bit of work recently talking about maybe we should stop asking ourselves what Jesus would do in these scenarios and start asking ourselves what Zacchaeus would do, recognizing that often we are complicit with power. And I know that I am complicit with, the bits of power that oppress people in so many ways. And maybe I need to be confronted, as Zacchaeus was, by Jesus, in order to have transformation myself. So when I think about the ways in which I personally hold power in relationships, I try and think, how am I being ministered to, and how am I being confronted with my own power by like spending time on the margins? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think power is a really interesting thing, and I was going to say that there are two wrong responses to power, but actually there are multiple wrong responses, but let me just mention two of them. One of them is to abuse power, and I'm going to say something about that in a minute. And obviously the way I view it in terms of the global economic system, power is being abused. There are people, because of wealth and status and political power and so on, who are using it to impoverish all countries, but also through that, therefore, to impoverish people who are literally starving or dying because they don't have access to resources. But the other way I think that can sometimes be a wrong response to power is almost to deny that we have it. And I think it's really important to recognize that we all have power. I mean, I'm a white middle-aged man, and I'm educated as well to a pretty high standard. So that gives me all kinds of power that other people don't have. But actually, the right response to that, it seems to me, I mean, some of those things I can't do anything about. I am white, middle-aged and educated. And the right response to that to me is not for me, if I can put it this way, to deny that power or to pretend it doesn't exist. It's to say, actually, okay, I have that. How do I ensure that I use that power appropriately and effectively and so on? And the reason I'm mentioning this is some conversations I've just had in the last week. So in the last week, I've been talking with a lot of colleagues from sub-Saharan Africa. These are from Zambia and from Kenya and from Nigeria, about this issue of global tax justice. And one of the things that was coming through from these colleagues of mine, and when I say colleagues, that makes it sound like we're part of the same organization. I just mean people I work with in the kind of tax justice space. So these are from Tax Justice Network Africa. And one of the things they were saying is that, look, Justin, the corporations who are behaving badly, they're all based in the global north. Many of them are registered in the city of London. And what they were saying is the effects of their behavior is seen on the ground here in Zambia, but the decisions that they're taking are being made in offices in London. And what they were saying to me, these colleagues of mine, is that you have a voice into their space in a way that we in Zambia don't. So you can lobby your own parliament. You can also lobby those corporations directly. And you have, effectively, they were saying, you have the power to speak to them and to hold them to account in a way that we in Zambia don't. So would you please do that for us? And if I turned around and sort of said, well, I mustn't, use my power, for want of a better phrase, then actually I'd be saying no to the colleagues of mine who are sort of at the sharp end of this. So it's about an appropriate use of power. It's not, I mean, Lucy was making the point that it's not about assuming that I know best. And what I do with these corporations has to be directed by my colleagues in Zambia and Kenya and Nigeria. It's not me deciding. But once they ask me to do these things, then I need to advocate on their behalf at their request, because I do have this access in a way that they don't. And so it seems to me that that's not a denial of power, but an appropriate use of the power that I've been fortunate enough to have, I suppose.
Yeah, I love that. Like, which tables do I have a seat at where I can do some nudging and recognize that I might be on the table, and that gives me the opportunity and the right to say something.
And I loved in the video that introduces the organisation that you work for, Lucy, Gateshead Poverty Truth Commission, that it recruits experts from within the community who have experienced poverty to talk about their experiences, to decide or determine or influence. So you just connect them, and acknowledging that expertise that is within those communities is quite revolutionary, but also makes sense, perfect sense.
Yeah, and I like it because I think I spent a lot of time thinking that campaigning and advocacy and calling for change has to be really shouty and angry. And actually, I think there is space for that. I think that's really important. I think sometimes we need to stand outside institutions and shout, but I think often real change happens when simultaneously conversations are being had in the same room over a cup of tea and some really nice cake. We people can look each other in the eye and recognise that actually we're not that different. And actually, we probably want the same thing. The guy in Gateshead who works for the DWP and the guy in Gateshead who's been sanctioned 3 times and has seen the effects of that affect his mental health, they probably deep down have an awful lot in common and probably want the same things. So if we can share that cup of tea and have those conversations, that is going to lead to change, I think. And that's something that really excites me about the Poverty Truth Commission model.
I definitely think, for me, the lens through which I look at this is this thing about identifying the power that you've got. And all of us actually have power. I mean, we've mentioned various ways, but, there are other forms of power, aren't there? There's power that comes through having a charismatic personality, or, it's not just about the sort of basics of gender and race and age and so on. But I think it's about thinking through, what does it mean to use that appropriately? And I'm kind of using that word appropriately because I think for me, a large part of that is about ensuring that you are spending time with, in the way that Lucy has described, those who are at the kind of sharp end of struggles, of whatever form, and listening to them. And obviously in an ideal world, we would have a far more kind of distributed system of power, that you wouldn't have these power imbalances. But the reality is, we are where we are, where these imbalances, I suppose, occur. Let me give you a historical example. We all talk about the abolition of the slave trade as an example of, I suppose, social justice being championed eventually, or at least to some extent. But it is very important, or it seems to me that it was important, that we had both the Lauda Equianos talking about their experience of slavery and what it meant, and giving that first-hand account, plus the William Wilberforces. So I suppose I look at this not from the point of view of we only need Lauda Equianos, if I can put it that way, people who've experienced poverty, because it did also, I think, require someone like Wilberforce stand up in Parliament and to change the system. So if I can pick up, and I don't know if this will be a difference between Lucy and I, but to take the example she just gave of the person working for the DWP and the person experiencing sanctions. And it's about recognizing, it seems to me, that the person working for the DWP is also working within a policy framework that they haven't chosen. And so to some extent, you're probably absolutely right that that individual has the same goals as the person who's experienced the sanctions. But maybe I'm slightly more skeptical or cynical than you, Lucy, because it seems to me that the person writing the policy framework for the DWP official, perhaps the parliamentarian or the minister responsible for it, doesn't have quite as altruistic motives. So, I mean, I loved what you said earlier, Lucy, about, doing the shouting is kind of one end of campaigning, but there's also other ways of bringing people together. I suppose if I'm honest, I'm probably more at the shouty end. You're probably much more effective at the kind of gentle relational end. But I think we need both, is what I'm trying to say.
I've spent so long trying to figure out whether I should be shouting or whether I should be sitting around the table. And I do just think we need absolutely all modes. And I think the importance is that we do it in, I was going to say that we do it in love, and that sounds really naive and silly. But what I mean by that is I think the thing that makes what we do faith-based is that sense of, I was listening to a podcast the other day that was talking about St. Therese and the little way and how we do everything with a bit more kindness. And I think there's space for that, whether we're shouting or whether we're around the table. And that's maybe what faith-based campaigning brings, is that recognizing that even, and I totally agree with you, Justin, that we have policies which are frankly evil and violent. I think we have policies that are violent towards vulnerable people in our society, and I think they are not made naively. I think people know what they're doing. But if we still see Christ in them, that is such a challenge. But I think it's a challenge that we need to pick up the mantle for. I hope that doesn't sound naive.
No, can I, just as Lucy was talking there, I thought about Jesus. You made me think about Jesus, Lucy. I was just thinking, that actually, if you look at his example, it seems to me that he embraced a range of approaches to bring about change. So I think of the example of what he did in Luke 5, for instance, the man with leprosy, where what Jesus did in his healing was he touched the man. And Luke's use of that phrase that Jesus touched the guy was absolutely intentional, because obviously a rabbi wouldn't normally have touched someone with leprosy, because that would have made the rabbi unclean and so on. And so there's a very kind of relational, physical approach that Jesus is taking there. So that's kind of one way of Jesus, I think, trying to change social systems, social structures. The very fact that he's touched this guy, let alone healed him, brings that guy back into the religious community. There's a whole lot of stuff to be said there. So that's one way of acting. But also at the same time, Jesus, for want of a better phrase, shouted. And what I mean by that is, he said to the Pharisees, "You brood of vipers." He went into the temple, the economic system of the day, and overturned the tables and made a whip and drove out the animals from the temple. So we have in this Jesus these occasions where he's unbelievably gentle and relational. And unless we're playing with what the word relational means, it's hard to... We wouldn't normally in English use the word relational for what he did in the temple, or when he said to the Pharisees, "You brood of vipers." So I sometimes think, I think probably this is where I'm coming from, that with those who are exercising their power abusively, that sometimes with those kind of folks, we need to sort of stand and just shout, "Stop, no more." But the exercise of power with other people is very different to that. So it's very much a both-and approach as well. And I think Jesus models that for us.
I was thinking too about how God and Jesus use power, in that Jesus will say, "What do you want me to do for you? You're the expert on your own life. Your faith has healed you." It's not parachuting in and, "Well, clearly you want this." There are times when Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" And I think there's that honouring of people's power.
Yeah, and I absolutely believe that liberation theology way of thinking about God's preference for the poor and the marginalised, that's where God is. And if we're there, and if we are trying to figure out what's going on there and where God is, then we're going to get really angry. Because I have people who'll come and volunteer at the little food bank distribution centre we've got in the part of Gateshead I work in, come because they want to do something nice and want to save. And then within 6 months, they are absolutely ready to go and do some campaigning or get really, really angry. Because like what you said, Justin, there are people who are misusing and abusing power and forgetting the humanity of the people they're creating policies against. And actually, if you spend time with those people who are suffering that abuse of power, you can't help but want to drive some animals out the temple.
Figuratively, of course, Lucy.
It hasn't happened literally yet, but we don't have livestock at Gateshead Food Bank, so who knows?
Well, that leads us to a question that came up online when I asked if anyone would have some questions. Someone was saying, well, what can we learn from theologies that are outside of the global north? And it ties in with our thinking about privilege, because, we don't want to be saying, well, we've taken all your assets and your cheap labour and now, you're poor. Could we have the wisdom that you've now gleaned from being poor as well, please? So how do we manage that? How do you learn in a way that isn't just another type of asset stripping?
I'm really pleased that the person who asked that question said theologies, because I think sometimes there can be a kind of naive use of language that sort of thinks there's one theology in the global north and there's one in the global south. And to be honest, sometimes, one of the things I've done is I've read reports from development agencies about theology, Christian development agencies, and they've referred almost to the theology of the global south as if there is one, but there's not, there's multiple. And I think that's important because actually those multiple theologies from the global south differ with each other and disagree with each other. So to take one example that Lucy's just mentioned, liberation theology. So liberation theology obviously is known for this preferential option for the poor, but it's also known for at least some expressions of it for being very closely associated with some Marxist ideas. And there are some theologians who, in their writing, have said that the experience of poverty is so severe and so bad that actually in changing the system, we have to use violence. If you go to Latin America, the churches that are full are those who advocate effectively a Pentecostal theology of poverty. Now, a global South Pentecostal theology of poverty is very, very different from a liberation theology of poverty. So a Pentecostal one is much more about spiritual power. It's much more about dynamic oppression. It's much more about praying out poverty and believing that poverty is not caused by the economic system of the government, but is caused by spiritual forces, which can be prayed away in various forms. I'm generalizing here, of course, but what I'm saying is this is the reality of what theologies of poverty look like in the global South. They're incredibly variable and sometimes contradict one another. Sometimes we in the global North, I think my observation is that we pick the parts of global South theology that we like, and then we call it the global South theology of poverty.
So are there any sources then that you would point to that have influenced your theology in a positive way?
Oh, multiple. There's something called an African theology of reconstruction, which I really like. There's a particular theologian called Mugambi who's written a lot about that. And essentially what he is saying is that African theology has taken for far too long a kind of second place, a received place. It's been a reaction to global North theologies. And what effectively he's saying is, look, we've got to develop our own. Now, he doesn't spend a lot of time going into what that would look like, but I think he identifies the problem correctly. I mean, who am I to say? But what he's saying is we've got to now begin a process of developing our own theologies and owning them for ourselves and stop simply reacting to the theologies that have been given us from the global North. So it's called an African theology of reconstruction, and I really like that. I also like, despite what I've just said, many aspects of liberation theology. I just think my slight critique of liberation theology is that sometimes it's claimed to be things that it's not. So to give one another example of that, liberation theology actually is very critical of development projects or development aid. It doesn't think development is the solution to poverty, international development. It thinks the solution is a change in the economic system. And I actually would completely agree with them about that. And I think that's been a significant influence on me as well, that it is about the economic systems. It's not about just continually giving charity.
Yeah, I totally agree with that last point, Justin. And then see that on a really local basis, where I find actually being part of stuff like the food bank and food provision really frustrating, because it's just that sticky plaster stuff, isn't it, when actually systems need to be changed. And yeah, if people are hungry, they probably do need food, but how do we go upstream? I'm also very challenged by that reflection on there not just being one theology from the global South, because truly when I'm asked that question, I thought, beyond liberation theology, and a very shallow understanding that I have of that, I can't talk about theologies of the global South, whereas I could talk about some typical theologies of the global North, but actually they're just my understanding of the few worshiping communities I've been in the UK. And I could talk about bits of those where I see power being abused, and I could talk about bits of those where I see power being addressed and deconstructed, and that feels really positive. But for me, thinking about power and the gospel, I think the cross, Richard Beck, the North American theologian, talks about this. So I'm in the global North. I'm sorry, Emma, I know that wasn't the question.
I love Richard Beck, so carry on.
Yeah, me too. And he talks about the cross as like a compass, and Jesus died with the God-forsaken on the margins outside the city walls, like in the Hebrews, where it says that Christ was like crucified outside the gate. And that's where we need to be if we're looking for God.
So much of his learning comes from the people he engages with in his prison ministry, doesn't it? Because people who aren't brought up, Christian culture and have all these stories in their heads, you just find when you tackle these stories with people that don't have that background, you get such novel ways of seeing them that can really open up the stories, I think, anew.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I've really enjoyed in this job is I've been doing a little series of Bible studies up in one of the communities way out at the West Gateshead, and it's an ex-mining community, and it was category D is what people call it. So when the mine closed, the council wanted to close it, and then all the people, they were used to unions and they were used to uniting, and they said, "You're not closing our town." So they're still there, but they're really geographically marginalised. They're a beautiful community. They have some of the most beautiful council estates in the world, but they've got their problems. But I've been running some Bible studies there with just like 5 or 6 of the old ladies that go to the Methodist Church, who I have absolutely loved calling during lockdown because they ask lots of lovely questions. It's like having 5 grandmas, really. But my point is, we read the Beatitudes together. It was just before lockdown. And I'm used to reading the Beatitudes in context where we discuss them. Ah, yes, the meek. Well, I suppose we do see meek people in society, and I'm sure Jesus meant, gosh, how annoying. And these women were just like, blessed are the meek. Yeah, you know what? I am quite meek because I've had a bit of a tough life. Or I am blessed because I do make the peace in my family because we have loads of fight. And then someone who said, oh yeah, like I am blessed because I've experienced lots of death of close family members over the last few years, and I'm really blessed. And I'd always read about like liberation theology and thought, oh, that sounds really nice in practice. And then actually in that moment I thought, maybe this is it in reality, which is just that like these people here actually know that Jesus is present and like take the Bible almost quite literally, that like different reading of scripture. I found that quite a profound moment, really.
See, I think that touches on an issue that affects many of us. I was going to say affects all, but that's very presumptuous. Affects many of us, which is that, or certainly maybe this is just my background, but, I was brought up with a particular theology and was very much told, that's what Christians believe. And I'm very much more now in a place where I think I know vaguely what I believe, although oftentimes I don't. But I also recognize that I absolutely don't have a monopoly on the truth. And there are many other ways of reading scripture and reading theology. And I'm not in a place of saying kind of anything goes, if I can use that phrase. But I'm very much in a place of saying that I think the amount of gospel truth that I've got a grip on is tiny. And there is so much more truth out there, and other people will have those bits of truth. And so I need to listen and learn and just remain incredibly open. And even if I'm not necessarily persuaded by what someone else is telling me from their reading of scripture, I need to remain open to the possibility that they're right and I'm wrong. But it's that principle of saying, not everything I believe it is right. And there are lots of other ways of looking at scripture and theology out there that I need to just hold openly and say, yeah, they might be right.
Well, and just to make it completely heretical, is that it's not a binary of, oh, then I must be wrong and you must be right. There's some sort of relational ground there, like Rumi talks about. There's a field out beyond right doing and wrong doing, and I'll meet you there. That's, I think, where the creative living takes place. Truth, I think, is quite a spacious place. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But that's just me.
I think it circles back to what we were talking about before. If we believe we're the holders of truth, and you know what? It actually happens to be this particular strain of 21st century Protestantism that's got it all perfectly. And we need to go out into communities and into the global south and into that place where God is not. And we need to tell them exactly which doctrines are going to bring Jesus here. Then how are we ever going to have equal distribution of power? And like whether we're doing that in the global south or in marginalised bits of Gateshead, for me, if we approach theology like that, it's colonialism, or it certainly reeks of it. And so whereas if we go in with that humility that probably haven't got all of this wrong, and I've certainly got a lot to learn, and you might be part of my learning and coming closer to whatever truth might be in this context, then we're certainly going to meet on a more even playing field, aren't we? And in my experience, are more likely to encounter something of God.
And I think, just to pick up on what Lucy said, that thing about experiencing different communities and different people, I think is really important, because one of my observations, particularly through social media, is that if our social life is navigated to a large extent, or at least our views are navigated through social media. It's very easy to surround ourselves with people that are just an echo chamber for us. And we only read the kind of books we like to read, and we only follow the kind of people we like to follow. And I think it's really important to, now some would say this makes me inconsistent, but I'm going to put it this way, to constantly change your views. And I kind of try and check myself once a year, what important ways have I changed my views about an issue through an encounter with an individual, or through hearing someone speak, or whatever, a podcast, or reading something. And if I ever find myself in a place where I've not changed my view on some issues, then I think that's a really worrying place to be, because that suggests that you think you've arrived, and none of us have arrived. And I think a lot of it is, as Lucy says, through encountering people who think very differently to you. And that is interesting. If I can sort of put a slightly provocative point for Lucy, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I don't know, because in the last year, I suppose, I have spent a bit more time with, and these are people who have just become friends of mine, but with people in the UK. So my experience of poverty has much more been in Africa, frankly. But in the UK, I've spent a lot more time with some people who are on universal credit and have experienced sanctions and so on. And one of the ways they've challenged my views is that some of them, and a higher proportion than I would have guessed, let me put it that way, have essentially said, I think it's pretty generous, the system, actually. And it's fine, and it's worked for me, and it's been okay. And I've said, yeah, but what about sanctions? And what about this? And it's just a higher proportion than I expected. Now, obviously, there are others who have talked about the challenges they faced and have really gone to town. And in one sense, they've reinforced the view I had before. But some have definitely said that they think the transition to the universal credit has been okay, and they're doing okay on it. And that has challenged my perspective, because these are folks on universal credit. So I don't know, maybe it's just the individuals I've met and got to know.
Or the fact they're talking to you, maybe.
Possibly.
I'm smiling to myself with that, Justin, because I came into this job with such a guardian reading understanding of what we thought to say about everything. And I have been challenged on that so much. And one of the big things that I often talk about with a couple of the guys from the Poverty Truth Commission is that I just came into this role with the absolute belief that we shouldn't tell people what to do with their money. And actually, a couple of these guys are always saying, if I weren't given all this money at once, or if I weren't given so much autonomy, then I might be able to control my finances a bit better. Like, one guy's recovering from addiction, and he talks a lot about how we shouldn't give addicts lots of money. And I always say, but we mustn't be paternalistic. We mustn't, must we? We must let people make their own choices because they're capable of that. And I'm like, oh, shut up, Lucy. You mustn't just take this single path where if you believe that the DWP makes cruel policy decisions, you therefore believe that everyone on universal credit's having a horrible time and that nobody needs any help. Mm-hmm. And actually, do you know what? I know people on universal credit who've had the top up that's currently temporarily for a year, and who have said, this has been really good for me. Like, I spoke to one guy the other day who during lockdown has managed to clear all of his debt, because with the extra money that he got from universal credit, he could get a debt relief order. And suddenly he's in the money. Like, he's talking about going to the beach for the first time in years, thinking, oh, this isn't actually fitting with some of the campaigns I'm signing up for online, is it? And so for me, it's similar to how it's very easy to say, oh, I support X political party, and therefore all my decisions are made about policies. I just have to toe that line. Actually, if we encounter people, lives are really complex, and one truth is never going to be true, and policies change and economics change, and the truth is that individuals are all completely different. So Justin, I'm so unsurprised that you've encountered that, because that's the reality of people's lives being messy and policies having different effects on different people. I don't think the universal credit is good, but I do think it's probably good for some people.
Yeah. And actually, a parallel thing is evident in theologies of the Global South. I mean, I mentioned Mugambi, who said that, African theologians need to develop their own way of thinking and not be beholden to the global north. But there are also African theologians who say, actually, we've only been thinking about theology for 100 years. You've been thinking about it for 1900 years. We've got a lot to learn from you in the global north, so we need to listen and learn to you. And that's some African theologians saying that. And it's very patronizing, I think, of us if we were to turn around to those people and say, oh, no, you don't really understand. You really are oppressed, even if you don't feel it. Let me tell you that you're oppressed. You've just got to take people, I think, at face value. And that means you're going to get contradictory responses. You're going to get some on universal credit who say it's been great for them and others who say it's really awful for them. Similarly, theologians from Africa, they will have diverse opinions. But I think it's about encountering lots of different people to try and get a real breadth view, or at least that's been my experience.
Yeah, and saying, actually, if I treat someone as two-dimensional, they're just going to reinforce all the things that I believe are true, then you're not actually going to enter real relationships, and you're not going to be further challenged. Whereas if you actually get to know people, you have those conversations, you have to work through that stuff and figure out how to get alongside them. And then instead of just walking away and wiping your hands saying, okay, if this is the reality for you, how can I get alongside you? Which campaigns should I be signing up for? And which institutions should I be shouting outside? And how can I practically be a friend to you in this situation? That's just the result of really deep relationship, I think, just some of the stuff that my work's about.
So then, especially now when we're not exactly shut in, but we're more or less on lockdown, and social media is not a great place to encounter people you don't agree with. So how can you build that sense of development of your ideas, and how do you personally seek out new ideas and new thinking?
Shall I go, Justin?
Yeah.
Not that I really have an answer. I've basically come off social media in lockdown because I got really annoyed when people were just repeating my views and I was in an echo chamber. I thought, oh, come on, Lucy, you can do better than this. And then I got really annoyed when people were anti-vaxxers and talking about how you shouldn't wear masks. And I thought, there's just no winning here. I actually don't think there's any winning on social media. And I certainly haven't seen anyone's mind changed in the way that you were describing, Justin. So I've decided that's not the way. I remember when I did an internship with Christian Aid, and I remember one of the heads of policy there sat me down and said, Lucy, if you really want to know what's going on in the world, in the morning you should read 5 different news outlets. You should read The Guardian and Conservative Home, and you should read The Times, and you should read a broadsheet, and then, listen to a piece of radio that you wouldn't usually listen to. And so obviously that's not about relationship, but it's about looking at the world from different perspectives and see what different people are looking for. The challenge is, again, not to look and have your own opinions reinforced, because confirmation bias is such a slippery slope to getting stuck in a corner and not letting your opinions be changed. But I don't do that. I don't read 5 different news outlets every day, but I sometimes do scroll through Conservative Home, which I find challenging, but also really enlightening. Really, quite helpful in thinking about things. What about you, Justin?
I think it's 2 things. So I think it's partly about meeting people, and it's also partly about what you read and consume. And so, in one sense, I think it's easy to get alternative opinions in the way that you've just described. We can scroll through Conservative Home and we can follow individuals that we know we're going to disagree with. And one of the things piece of leadership advice that I once heard, and I think it applies to this, was that it was talking to kind of church leaders, and it was saying, if you've got a difficult person in your church who just disagrees with everything that you say, then one of the things you can do is sit down with them and identify out of 100 things that they're complaining about, what is the one thing they're complaining about where you actually agree with them? And they said, talk about that one thing and make a kind of, try and build a relationship on that one area where actually they're making a really valid point, and so on. So what I'm trying to say is, for me, I think it's more about having an openness of mind that almost whatever I read and whoever I encounter, I don't instantly dismiss them in a kind of tribalist sort of way, because they're from that group, they must be wrong. And just having, I suppose, it's humility, and I'm not very good at humility, but it's having that humility to be able to say, I still think you're wrong on 90%, I say, but there's this 5 or 10%. Actually, maybe you're not, it's not even that you're convinced they're right. You're just saying maybe they are right. And I'm going to be open to that possibility. And I think you can do that on social media. I think you can do that with the news outlets you read, but you can also do that with people that you meet. So, when I encounter people who I don't normally spend time with, and they say stuff that I don't normally agree with, I just try and ask myself that question: where are they coming from? Might it be that actually what they're saying here is right? So for me, it's much more about an attitudinal thing. And I think that has helped me.
There was a conversation on Radio 4 a few weeks ago with Rowan Williams and Marilyn Robinson, who wrote the Gilead books.
I heard it,
yeah. Well, I tuned in because I thought, great, two people I really respect. And truthfully, I understood very little of it. So I've saved it on BBC Sounds to listen again. But Justin, if you listen to this, you might be able to recall more of this than I can. But Marilyn Robinson was talking about that concept of looking at people and thinking, I've got so little in common with you and I agree with you on so little, and how that's led to these huge silos. And she was talking about American politics, I think, and the way that people just seem to be pulling apart. And she said that underneath all of that, we've just lost any sense of the fact that human consciousness is sacred. And like that person is fundamentally them, in that they are their mind and their thoughts. That is sacred territory. And I think that's exactly what you were saying. Does that chime?
Yeah, no, I probably nicked it from her. I just think it's so important to encounter views and experiences and people that are instinctively different to you. That's all.
Amen. I had a conversation last week with a guy who I work with, and he's one of the communities I work in, and I think he had forgotten that I'm employed by the Methodist Church, because he spoke for a long time about just fundamental evils of religion and organised religion particularly. And do you know what? It was really good for me to hear, because I was reminded that the majority of people that I encounter in our communities don't think that the church is a fundamentally good thing. I mean, sometimes I agree with him, but most of the time I come from a perspective where, like, the church is at least trying to be good news, and to be reminded that it often isn't, like, pretty confronting, but actually really important for me to hear, I think. So I do agree with you, Justin.
Did you have anything else you wanted to ask of each other?
Can I ask Lucy a question?
Yes.
Or perhaps I can offer a brief reflection. I'd love to hear Lucy's response to it, which is that one of my observations of the UK church, as well as UK society, but I think the church is reflecting society in this, is I think we've become far more nationalistic. So I'll be honest, my heart and what drives me is kind of global issues of poverty to a much greater extent than UK issues of poverty. I'm not denying that obviously poverty exists in the UK and it's a real problem, but my heart and my passion is around global issues of poverty. But my observation as I talk in UK churches is that far more often than I would have in the past, people come back with, yeah, but don't we need to think about our own poor, the poor in our country? There seems to be this kind of narrowing of boundaries towards, let's think about our own. And even then, it gets narrower further. They might say, think about our own in our town, the town we happen to be in. It's not even at a national level, it's at the poor in our town. And there's sometimes an attitude of almost like, until we fix the poverty in my town, only then might I think about the poverty in my country. And the poverty in sub-Saharan Africa is like way away. I'm not really going to think about that. So my question, I suppose, Lucy, is, do you think that change is right? When I say right, I mean, do you think it's happening? And is that problematic? Because I guess I think it is a bit problematic that we narrow ourselves too rapidly.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally think it's problematic. Whether it's a change, I don't know, Justin. I won't pull the age card, but I know.
Lucy's a lot younger than me, everyone.
I can't comment on that change, Justin. But I'm so sorry. I do think it's a problem, and I don't really know what the answer is, how we counteract that. It's so worrying, isn't it? Because while I totally agree that aid isn't the answer, and we need a change of global economic systems, I also think we really need to protect our aid budget, and the narrative you're describing feeds into that. Oh, we shouldn't be giving other countries stuff if we've got all these problems here. And Yeah, I think as a church, we've always been pretty good at thinking of our global neighbours as well as our local ones. And maybe they're like swung back in the other way, like because UK poverty has been pretty shocking in the last few years. And I think maybe awareness of that has changed and people are realising that. And we've also seen some amazing campaigns run by the churches. I wonder if maybe we've started to realise that there's poverty over here too, and suddenly maybe the swing's really too far, and we struggle to split our attention, don't we? And maybe that's just like the human condition, that we can only think about so much suffering, and we can only think that we might be part of a certain solution. And I would love to see that narrative shifted so we recognise that it is all connected. Like I think we've just discovered today in this conversation that we're talking about the same things here, aren't we? And we're talking about the same symptoms of living in a broken world that are causing poverty on the streets next to us, and that massive discrepancy between the global north and the majority world. And so maybe we need to, like, as churches and as UK churches, shift our theology to talk about some of that, to move away from some of those geographical specificities and more about the reality that in all those global places where there is suffering, there is also the imperative to speak into that. That was a pretty vague answer. Are you happy with that, Justin?
So there's an element of overwhelm then, really, and especially now, do you think?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, especially in 2020, surely. I think, although I find like compassion fatigue a bit, I find that hard to get my head around. I do think it is hard to, as one person, understand and absorb the capacity for human suffering that there is in the world. But I do think that perhaps as Christians we need to remember that it's not all like happy all the time. We don't have this, like we have to sometimes gaze into things that are really difficult and look at human suffering and recognise what it is, because you have to do that in order to be part of the solution sometimes, don't you? It sounds like you've done quite a bit of gazing in your time, Justin. How do you manage to not get overwhelmed by it?
I'm going to mention the age thing here now, because I think, because I really have observed the compassion fatigue thing, or maybe let me put it a different way. What I've observed is when I was in my 20s, everyone I knew, all of my friends, we were all concerned for poverty in the world and wanted to do anything about it. And we were all going to go out and change the world. And, a lot of us went and spent a year or two doing our bit somewhere in the world for something. But obviously, this is not true of all of my friends from that era, but a lot of my friends from that era, as they've sort of, life has happened and they've gone on and they've got families and got jobs that paid well and got mortgages, etc., then, to put it bluntly, they've shifted their politics in a direction that has meant that they are less concerned. And so folks who are my age, the only way I can put it is that passion that, when we were in our early 20s, they had much greater than me, has just dwindled and died. And for some reason, I have kind of kept on to it and held on to it. But it is harder. So, Lucy, I don't know how old you are, but you're obviously a bit younger than me. But I also wonder if there's an age thing, is what I'm trying to say, that for some reason, as people get older and as life happens, their concern about some of these issues can dwindle. And often when at least before lockdown, spent quite a bit of my time talking to student groups about issues of tax justice and poverty. And one of the points I made is, look, it's brilliant that you've got this passion now, but the issue is, are you going to have this passion for issues of global justice in 10 and 20 and 30 years' time? And unless you think about this and unless you do things intentionally, it's very easy for, as life happens, for you to lose your passion for social justice. And I was just appealing to them, please don't lose it, but also saying that the enthusiasm you've got now will wane if you're not careful. And I think part of that, and I'll stop with this, is this issue of our neighbour. And I think we're commanded, aren't we, to love our neighbour. And I just have a really strong view that my neighbour, yes, is the person who lives in the house next to me, but just as much was those colleagues I was chatting to from Zambia earlier this week, or my friend who lives in a poor community in Kenya. They are my neighbour exactly in the same, or not exactly in the same way, but to the same extent that the person who lives next door to me is. And if I feel I have more responsibility towards them, then I really do. It's about expanding your concept of who is your neighbour, I think. And I would say that's in line with what Jesus taught about who our neighbour is. But it's having that expanded concept of neighbour, I think, helps, at least for me.
I was reading Barbara Brown Taylor's Altering the World during lockdown. I love that book. So lovely and perfect for lockdown. And she has a chapter on reverence as a spiritual practice. And she just spoke about actually looking at the things we're consuming. So like from our clothes to our coffee and our apples, and how that if we start to actually look at them with reverence, we do realise who our global neighbours are. My neighbour is the person who I am directly having a relationship with because they're working in a factory in Bangladesh. I found that really helpful. And just to go back to your conversation about generations, Justin, part of me thinks this year, seeing in the last couple of years, this like youth climate movement shows me a bit of hope that actually these younger generations can like reinvigorate and have upflow, because I've seen the folk in like my parents and grandparents like get this zest for advocacy and for being part of this like fire that Greta Thunberg has sparked because of the younger generations. I hope that's an encouragement.
I really hope you're right, Lucy. I really hope you're right. Sorry, that sounds really cynical and old manish. I'm sure you're right that that's what's going to happen. But, well, and perhaps on the issue of climate change, it really will, because the thing we know about climate change is only going to get worse and worse and worse. It's not going to, you could argue global poverty has got slightly better. You know, there are fewer, depending on which metric you use, poor people than there were 20, 30 years ago. But climate change is just it's on a downward trajectory. So I really hope, and I believe you're right on that. And
I wonder if, I'm just formulating this thought now, so it may either be completely unoriginal or completely untrue, but as we come to this, well, we're already here, aren't we? We're in absolute climate emergency. The fire is raging. We're realising we have to put it out. And I think nations are understanding that it's going to have to be economic policies that change, that actually we're going to have to put money behind this. I'm hoping that might change people's understanding of which systems do have to change to affect change. And so as we see economic systems becoming more green, like a Green New Deal, different understandings of growth, that maybe that policy change might feed into the way we think we tackle poverty. Is that a hope that you share, Justin?
Definitely is, because they're absolutely interrelated. The economic and the climate systems, it's our economic policies in the global north that has driven the climate crisis. So it's our economic policies that have to change. And obviously, the virtuous circle behind this is that if we change those policies, they can help both those who are struggling with poverty, both in the global north and global south, as well as address the climate via mechanisms like the Green New Deal, as you say. So there's hope there. But then sometimes in my darker moments, I don't know, maybe I hold on to what Martin Luther King said. I'm going to get, the quote won't be exactly right, but Martin Luther King said, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And I need to hold on to that it takes time. We got to dig in for the long haul, but slowly, poli poli, as they say in Kenya.
I think one of the themes that I've heard in what you've said is awareness. So you talked about, when you meet someone that you suspect you'll disagree with, just pausing for a minute and not just assigning them the stereotype that you have in your head. And if you having a conversation, just taking a minute to listen further and being aware of where your clothes are made, being aware of what you're buying. There's just that level of awareness that I think might be one of the practical suggestions that we can leave people with, that's come out from what you've said. It's such a big topic, and it can feel hopeless. So I wondered if you can offer some signs of hope and some things that people can actually engage with, some practices or some activities that they could do.
So I'm going to mention a practical thing right now, just sparked by our kind of short conversation. I often use this when I teach on this, which is just that if someone's listening to this right now, I'd suggest they have a look at the labels on the clothing that they are wearing this minute and just see which countries they've been manufactured in, and pray for whoever stitched that bit of clothing. And I suspect for most of us, we are probably wearing clothing. A lot of it comes from East Asia, other parts of the world as well. And, it's just a reminder how our neighbour who we've never met, we are literally wearing, the produce of their hands. And it just helps bring it a little bit closer to home to us. I'll hand over to Lucy, who's going to give the voice of hope.
Oh, no, that's too great a mantle to bear. Going back to Barbara Brown Taylor, I do think that paying attention is a spiritual practice. And I think that also includes paying attention to people. So when we encounter someone who, and I'm paraphrasing Elizabeth Oldfield at the minute, actually, I haven't read her latest book, but I've listened to her latest interview on the Nomad podcast.
Theos.
Yes. So she heads up Theos, and she's amazing. And she talks about essentially some of the stuff we've been talking about today, about encountering people who are really different from us. And she talks about choosing neither to fight nor to flee when we encounter people who are different from us, but just to sit and hold on to that feeling and allow it to challenge us. Like, what is this thing that I'm holding on to so tightly that's creating this guttural reaction? Like, why is my instinct fear or shame or anger? And like leaning into that. I had a really good conversation with someone really dear to me the other day who was reading Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And she said, I'm feeling ashamed when I read this because there's so much in this that I didn't know about in terms of like the history of racism in the UK. And she said, but I think that means it's good that I'm reading it and I need to lean into that. And so without like theologizing it too much, I do think that's a spiritual practice too, about leaning into that really deep feelings of discomfort and allowing them to change us. I think if we can do that, and if each one of us did that, that would be such a sign of hope.
Yeah, being willing to sit with that discomfort, because it's not what's at the root. It's just a layer that there's something else deeper that holds us.
I'm slightly worried that we haven't given the listeners enough hope at the end there.
It's a complicated thing, and I don't think we have to go away feeling, oh, okay, well, that's all right then, not have any doubts or any difficulties, because I think you're reflecting the reality of especially long-term work in activism and in working towards relieving poverty is a tiring thing. So I think your honesty is part of the hope. I think if we can learn to be honest with each other, that's actually a hopeful thing.
If we do look at the history of the world, that sounds really grand. Wow. But if we look at major economic shocks to the world, often they've been devastating at the time they took place, but they have led to a better world, partly because I think during the shock, it forces communities and nations to sort of say, we can do better than this, can't we? And I mean, obviously, the Second World War was a dreadful thing, but it is true that a better economic system came out of the immediate post-war years precisely because the Second World War had been so awful for the world and for our various economies. And I think there's a lot of appetite for saying we can do things better. I suppose for me, a sign of hope is just that once the COVID crisis is over, and it will end, that the world that we create, or at least the national systems that we create, will be better than they were before. And, it's like a phoenix, I guess, arising from the ashes, that there's just a small sign that something better might come out of this crisis that's going on.
And isn't that like exactly what the gospel is? Like, we see absolute darkness and death before resurrection and like the promise of eternal life. And so if we can't hold on to something better coming and be part of working for that, then we might have forgotten some of what's at the very heart of what it means to be a Christian.
Because it's not going to just land in our laps. We're all hopefully starting to work towards that and being part of that, making it, co-creating it maybe.
I love that. Language of co-creation. And we've seen so much kindness in 2020, haven't we? And I just don't think we should underestimate that.
Yeah. It's been really amazing to chat to you both, and I really appreciate your time.
I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you both for a really interesting conversation. Yeah.
I think it's been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it.
It's been a joy. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this conversation facilitated by the Susanna Wesley Foundation. You can engage with our work through following us on Twitter and Facebook, and at our website, susannawesleyfoundation.org. We would love to hear from you.